Greetings, YouTube. One of the things that I've been fascinated for years has been how there are so many people in the Western world, particularly in America, that are captivated by the Spartans. Now, the Spartans were one of the Greek city-states that existed in the classical era. And they were known for having a high level of martial excellence, though they were not the only group that had martial excellence, and they were not the only group that were considered worthy in the field of battle. And I think one of the reasons that we have this image is because of the comic and the movie 300. And I like to remind people that both the comic and the movie are pretty much written from the perspective of Spartan PR. If the Spartans had a PR division in the classical era, they would have presented the myth, and did present the myth, but they would have presented it to the public the way we do now, as the story of 300. 300 Spartans against an entire Persian army. When in actuality, yeah, the Spartans were there. There may have been 300. The numbers are probably, rounded up or down to make it nice, seem nice and convenient. But we also know there were 700 Thespians. Okay, there were 700 other troops there that had joined the in that battle. So there was over 1,000 troops in that. In the classical era, 1,000 warriors is considered an army. Even in the Middle Ages, a group of 200 to 300 people is an army. Okay, they didn't field armies the way we have fielded them in the modern era. Not even in the 19th century, we had much bigger armies. But in the classical era, 1,000 warriors is a very big army. And of course, we don't exactly know how many they fielded in the Persians, and a lot of the Persians were probably conscripts, the ones in the front. Some of them, of course, would be professional warriors, but the Persians would also have been using, and we know they did, they used a lot of conscripts. And the conscripts were literally, farmers or laborers shoved into the front of an army with a spear, a helmet, and if they're lucky, a shield and a dagger. And the really fortunate ones might have padded armor. But most of them would have had no armor, a shield, maybe a spear, and maybe a dagger. So they were not elite troops. But there would have been, elite troops with the Persians. They just would have been behind the cannon fodder. Though it wouldn't have been called cannon fodder. What would you call it back then? Meat shields? That's a good appropriate thing to call them. Yeah, they were meat shields. And they were there to slow down the incoming forces or wear down the forces if you were headed at them, just through the sheer numbers. Okay, so now you've had a little glimpse at the history. But it's also important to remember that the Spartans, like all Greek city-states, were slavers. They were slave owners. And unlike all the other Greek city-states, the Spartans enslaved their fellow Greeks, which was considered an incredible breach of etiquette and just beyond the pale. You didn't enslave fellow Greeks. All the other city-states just enslaved foreigners, because there were lots of foreigners. You got them from wars, you bought them from people, so foreigners were not hard to come by. And the entire Greek structure was based on slavery. All those wonderful talks about egalitarian equality and democracy were all standing on top of the corpses of, hundreds of thousands of slaves. It's important to remember that. And one of the reasons that the Spartans had such levels of great excellence in military skills is that they had to. They had to keep their slave populations, who outnumbered them significantly, terrified. Because a Spartan warrior in full gear, helmet, chest piece, greaves, arm guard, with his shield, with his sword, with his spear, a sarassus, which is a very long spear, could be like 20 feet long, as well as bows, and javelins. That was terrifying, especially when they were in a shield wall. So they terrified their slaves to keep them in line, but they also lived in a constant state of fear. because they knew they were outnumbered. It's not a great way to live, being constantly surrounded by people who hate you because you've enslaved them. So why do Westerners love them so much? You see them in high school teams named after them everywhere. There are races everywhere. They are, the symbol of CrossFit. There are lots of people out there using the symbols and ideology of the Spartans, and yet they were horrible people. They weren't good guys in the modern sense. Now, at the time, they were considered, bad because their fellow Greeks were like, you enslaved Greeks, we don't like you. They may have used the Spartans because they were useful, but they didn't respect them. They didn't like them. They were considered the bad boy of the neighborhood, essentially. But now we look back and somehow we've forgotten all the bad things. And we just look at the martial prowess like, wow, look at that. That's all manly and stuff. And we ignore the sexuality of the Greek warrior culture, which did engage in same-sex couplings. The modern Western world seems to forget that part. They forget the slaving bits. They forget the conquering. They forget the PR that just made them look really great. So why do we do that? Why do we cleave to the Spartan myth so thoroughly? Then again, we cleave to the Western myth that white people are somehow the top of the heap. We cleave to the American myth about our foundings and our current culture being so positive and so lauded and desired. Westerners seem to cleave to a lot of myths, but the Spartans for me sticks out. Maybe it's because most Westerners are historically ignorant. They don't know the history of the classical era at all. And I am an absolute layperson when it comes to that. I know some of it. I've done research on some of them. I've done some research, specifically on Spartans and specifically then a little broader on the classical era and a little broader on military and tactics and weapons of the era. So my knowledge is fairly broad, but also fairly shallow. I know people out there, just John from Many a True Nerds, know the classical era a hell of a lot better than I do, and he understands how the Spartans were viewed at the time and how they are viewed now, and it mystifies me. Spartans weren't good guys by any measure, and yet Americans loved them. They loved the idea. I remember my wife and I had gone to see the film 300 because I love a good classical era kind of a film. I like, that I love the arms and weapons. I really wanted to see the technology, how they did the weapons. I actually didn't like the swords they used in the film. I didn't thought that was a poor design. But we were sitting in the theater watching the film, and these like 4 guys are sitting in a row, 2 rows in front of us. And at some point fairly early in the film, we're like 25, 30 minutes into the film, the 4 of them get up and leave. And my wife watches them leave and looks at me and goes, what, the film's not gay enough? Which cracked me up. So yeah, why do Americans love the Spartans so much? Just because they've bought the myth, or because they'd like to think of themselves as slave-owning Mediterranean warriors who have a sham democracy? Maybe that's why.